You know those moments when a piece of art just kind of sticks with you? You can't really explain why. It's either something about the light or the tone or maybe the story behind it, but the fact is, it lingers with you for a long, long time. For me, one of those moments came when I revisited Van Gogh's Potato Eaters. Now, this painting isn't exactly the kind of thing that shouts beauty at first glance. It's very dark, it's gritty, the people in it look tired and sort of worn down, and somehow there is still something hauntingly human about it. The dim lamplight, the intimacy of that tiny little table, the simple act of sharing a meal. It's not glamour, it's just life. It's very raw, it's very humble, and it's real. And honestly, I think that's what hooked me. It made me want to capture that same kind of atmosphere in my own work. That sense of closeness, the warmth against the shadow, that story of a moment feeling. So in today's video, I want to take you through how that inspiration turned into my own piece, how inspiration works for artists in general, and how you can use it without feeling like you're copying something or just chasing trends. Before we dive into all of that though, a quick shout out to my Patreon crew. You guys are still the absolute backbone that keep projects like these alive. Through Patreon, you can get free behind the scenes footage, early access to new art, and even some exclusive merch drops up to 4 times per year. So if you want to support the channel and be part of the creative chaos, go ahead and check that out. The link is in the description down below. Alright, with all that out of the way, welcome back to another Butcher's Shop. So what exactly about this painting pulled me in? Because on paper, really just at first glance, it's kind of depressing. People are sitting hunched over around a small table. It's very dim light, dark tones. It doesn't really scream, make art like this. But when you start looking closer, the magic unfolds in the details. So let's get started with the lighting. Van Gogh used light like a storyteller. In the Potato Eaters, the only real light source is that little oil lamp hanging above the table. Everything else fades into darkness. There's no background clutter, no distracting colors. It's just faces, hands, and food illuminated by this warm, intimate glow. It's cinematic before cinema even existed. And that kind of light focuses the eye and pulls you straight into the heart of the scene. When you design a piece around a single light source, you get a couple of very big advantages. First off, the narrative focus is almost straight up automatic. Where light falls, or where the light touches something, that is where your story is. So you don't have to shove the viewer's eye around a million details. Secondly, a single light is emotionally evocative. It reads as intimate and fragile and human. It's very realistic, just like this family or, this group is gathered around some sort of sacred altar of warmth. For my piece, I wanted that same intimacy. I wanted a single warm lantern or some piece of candlelight that carves the characters out of the shadow. So the lamp kind of becomes the protagonist of the story. It becomes the actual storyteller. The composition of the original work is also a story on its own. If you look at how the figures are placed, they are crammed together around that table. There's almost no personal space, and yet it doesn't really feel suffocating. It feels communal in a way. So you, as the viewer, are practically sitting there with these people It's almost claustrophobic, but in a way that kind of draws you in, like you are part of this small and very quiet world. And I think that's what made me want to mirror that in my own work, that closeness, that shared moment. The idea that you're not just observing, but that you're present. And I wanted to mimic that. But I also wanted to expand the narrative possibilities. Rather than peasants eating potatoes, I imagined travelers, guards, merchants, maybe even an outlaw or two, who knows. More characters have more stories, but they still breathe the same air. Everyone is still crammed into that small space. So that leads us to the atmosphere of the piece. There's something about that golden brown palette that feels ancient, like an old tavern, lit by candlelight and smelling faintly of wood smoke and roasted potatoes. Because what else? It's got that earthy warmth that makes you think of simpler times. It reads as older times without being overtly historical. It's the color of centuries and of hands that have worked. It's that warm, slightly dirty palette that reads as comfortable and real without it being romanticized. The palette suggested a medieval or early modern tavern to my brain. You know, wood beams, stains, oil lamps, straw on the floor, and I don't know, maybe a bard humming in the corner. Now, I know Van Gogh didn't paint a tavern, but his light and palette made me imagine one. And that's where my imagination took a little detour. Because as I was studying the painting, my brain started sort of whispering, like, what if this wasn't a peasant family? What if this actually was a tavern scene? You know, like a bunch of travelers gathered around a table, or adventurers sharing their stories after a long day of quests. And I could suddenly see that so clearly, you know, like a rogue orc counting his coins, ogres ready to smash their opponents, that lady elf rolling a nat 20 on intelligence among those oafs. The same sort of intimate light and those same earthy tones, but instead of potatoes, there's gambling and there's gold and there's armored figures ready to burst into a brawl. A tavern is a composition of motion and stillness at the same time. So the trick is to stage the room so that the viewer reads primary, secondary, and tertiary actions. So in this particular case, we all see that orc in the middle, and immediately we wonder if he's up to something. Now remember when a moment ago I was talking about that single light source? The reason this orc is the first thing that draws your attention is because he is sitting right underneath that lamp in the middle. We also see tension between the bigger ogres. These are like the wardrobes of the scene. They're big, they're chunky, they don't really look all that elegant, but they're also not directly into the light of this lantern. So again, this ties into what I just explained. Because they are not into the immediate light source, they sort of fall into this mystery area where we see them and where they are definitely part of the story, but it takes a while before we get to them. And lastly, we see that lady on the left, and she is the only one who's actually laughing. So is she laughing at all these guys around her, or is she part of the joke? She is a lot closer to the light, and so she becomes more important. And this is really very much how I wanted to tell that story. So we still see a lot of these base elements from the potato eaters, but we see them in an entirely new daylight. In a dim, single light environment, the smaller details matter quite a lot because we can't really see everything. So simply put, what we do see has to be at 200%. You know, like the way cloaks hang down, or the curve of someone's shoulder, the negative spaces between people. All those are compositional tools. So they're important to use very consciously, and also to use so that they work for your story. And so when you've set up your entire composition, it's time to work with your focal point. So decide what needs to be at the center of attention and let the light fall off from there. So again, this is where you can see the orc in the very center of things, and everything outwards starts to get darker. As a result, the viewer's eye will naturally circle back to that well-lit area, and the rest of the room becomes the sort of discovery space. So that's how I expanded Van Gogh's compressed domestic scene into something more narrative and playfully fantastical, while keeping the emotional core intact. It's how inspiration works sometimes. It starts with something small, like a seed, if you will, and then your brain just sort of runs with it. The heart of the potato eaters, however, is still there. We still have that same warmth, that one light source, and that closeness that made the original piece so authentic. But suddenly, it's now breeding a different kind of story. Inspiration is not about replicating what we see. It is about turning it into something of your own by changing the narrative while adhering to the most fundamental parts of something. So basically all I did was change the characters, and because of that, this story now tells, or this illustration now tells, a completely different story. Now let's unpack that a little, because that all came out way more philosophical than I intended that to be. But what is inspiration? It's one of those words that artists use all the time, but still it's weirdly hard to define what exactly it is. For me, inspiration is that spark that connects the outside world to your inner one. It's not a single image or a sound, it's not even just a single sentence, but it is about how those things resonate with something that is already inside of you. You could look at the same painting as someone else and feel something completely different. Maybe they see sadness where you see peace, or maybe they see despair where you see resilience. And that's why inspiration is also so very personal. It's not just what you see or what you hear. It is how your brain filters that through everything you've lived through and everything that you've loved and lost. Sometimes inspiration hits you like lightning. Other times it creeps up slowly and it shows up as a color palette somewhere, or as a sound, or maybe some specific part of a book cover. It could be a random smell that brings back a memory. A couple of weeks ago, I made these pretty cool videos about scent-based art. If you've missed those, go ahead and check them out when you're finished watching today's episode, because I made these 3 illustrations purely based on specific smells. To do honor to the fact that I can finally smell again after 20 years, which is pretty special. And so I figured, you know what, let's ride with that. Let's do something with smell. But that's literally how you see that inspiration come to life. So I do recommend you watching those. But let's be honest here for a second. Inspiration isn't always pleasant. Sometimes it can be very, very uncomfortable. It can poke at you, it can challenge you, or even your beliefs. And sometimes it frustrates the living heck out of you. It can force your entire being to respond to it somehow in some form of way. And it simmers and it simmers until it comes out with some sort of burst. And then all of a sudden you have that eureka moment. You know, it's not cool, but it happens sometimes. And then afterwards, that's where it starts to become cool. For me, it's often less about what I'm inspired by and more about why I'm inspired by it. Why did that particular thing grab me? Why won't it leave my head? You know, once I understand the why, I can start building a piece around it that still feels authentic to me. So not just how I could make a copy out of what I feel, but how I can turn that feeling into a conversation between me and that original source of inspiration. If you've watched more episodes of The Butcher's Shop, you know that I am a true believer of art as the great connector of people. If art can spark a conversation, or if art can unite people through their differences, I think that on its own can create inspiration. Art is sort of the keystone to that circle, you know, like art inspires art. Art inspires conversations, which then inspire new art. And the more I think of it, the more I actually love the idea of how much we can achieve through creating something. Now, I won't turn this video into an essay about how terrible I think it is that we've allowed technology to take over so many of our creative and creating processes. But I just think about it for a quick second. Don't you think that we lost our ability to talk to each other and in return have only learned how to send a text message? Let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. I would love to hear your thoughts on this subject. Anyway, let's get into the tricky part of inspiration. How do you use inspiration without just copying someone else's work? And here's the thing. Being inspired by something doesn't mean replicating something. It means learning from it. And when I looked at the potato eaters, I did not want to recreate that same scene with the same characters. I wanted to create that feeling. So the closeness, the glow of candlelight against rough textures, that narrative intimacy of shared silence. You know, it's sort of an emotional DNA that I borrowed, so not the visual one. There is a big difference between influence and imitation. So influence is when you take what resonates and make it part of your own language. And imitation is when you trace the outline sort of and stop there. To give you an example, think of it like music. So a musician might be inspired by jazz, but still write rock music. You can hear the rhythm of the influence, but the melody is entirely its own. It's the same thing with art. If you see a style, or a composition, or a theme that makes your brain go, yes, I need this. Don't ask, how can I copy this? Ask yourself instead, why does this make me feel something? And how can I express that in my own way? And that's where you develop your voice as an artist. Once you have that essence, mutate it. Change the era, the subject, the scale, or the medium. Turn villagers into adventurers. Change potatoes into playing cards in this instant. Change faces to different species. Combining disparate influences is how distinctive works get made. Ask yourself this. What in my life relates to this? What memory or fear or joy connects to what you're trying to do? That personal seed makes the new piece actually yours rather than an homage. Maybe your own memory of a blackout as a kid is why a single lamp moves you. Put that in there. And while you do that, try to translate atmospheric features into a concrete technique. So if you want Van Gogh's lamplight, plan a value study with a single top-down light, or write a short checklist of technical decisions. Single top light, palette should be raw umber, yellow ochre, and burnt sienna, heavy background textures, and very crisp rims on the foreground. That could be sort of your very quick sort of note, on what you're trying to do. I was going to say prompt, but that's so much the wrong word choice, and I'm not looking for that, as you can obviously understand. But you see where I'm going with this. So write down in one sentence, with just a couple of keywords, what that essence is that you're trying to create. If your work is clearly derivative or an homage, be honest with yourself. Or be honest to the outside world even. Credit where credits are due. The ethics of influence really matter, especially today when everything gets shredded by AI. Copying another artist's composition or signature elements without transformation is just bad faith, especially if you pretend it to be your own. So respectfully acknowledging a source is actually very mature, and it kind of builds trust. Every artist practices, and every artist learns by actually replicating things, but it's never about the actual replication process. It is about the learning process that then pushes it forward. So this is why I keep saying this again. Inspiration is not about replication. It is about growing from there. So if you use a reference image, very much like I did here with the potato eaters, just acknowledge it. Just tell them, hey, I based this off of this particular painting, and this is how I try to make that into my own. And here's another important point, by the way. Inspiration often works in sort of layers. So you might start with Van Gogh's lighting and then add a pinch of fantasy storytelling from Tolkien, or mix in a texture you discovered from a modern painter, and you blend that all with your own life experiences. That's not stealing. That's alchemy. That's pure fucking magic. All right? So as long as you turn it into something of your own, as long as you stay authentic to yourself, inspiration is an excellent thing to move yourself forward to that point. Don't steal and don't replicate. Translate it into something that is yours. When you learn how to use inspiration consciously, it becomes part of your workflow. I often start a new piece by collecting references, not to copy them, but to analyze them. So what do I love about this color palette? Why does this composition work so well? How can I take this technique and twist it into something new? In one of my previous videos, I talked about color.io, which is a website where you can try out different color palettes, or even find them based on very specific photos. It can be a very helpful tool if you want to structure your working processes. Of course, you can also build inspiration mood boards, digitally or physically. Fill them with shapes or lightings or fabrics, little fragments that make your creative brain buzz. Don't limit yourself to other artists either. Inspiration can come from movies, nature, architecture, old books, even your own dreams. Inspiration is fuel, and you decide where that engine takes you. And here's something a lot of people forget. Inspiration doesn't always come before you start creating. Sometimes it shows up during the process, like You'll be halfway through a painting when suddenly you realize, ooh, this reminds me of that scene from that movie. And then you lean into it. You know, that is just as valid. That's where the phrase trust the process comes in. And even though I hate it when people say that, because I believe that art is as much giving thought to something and letting, the feeling of it find a way, this kind of is true. So let's wrap things up for a second. Inspiration isn't necessarily a mystery to be solved. It is a relationship to be nurtured. It's not about copying or chasing trends or trying to be someone else. It is about listening to the world around you, letting it echo inside you, and then translating that into something only you could make. For me, The Potato Eaters was never about potatoes or peasants. It was about light, and it was about humanity and that quiet connection of people sharing that crammed space. My version might feature an orc and ogres and an elf instead, but the heartbeat is the same. And maybe that's the point. Art isn't about where inspiration comes from, it is about where you take it, or where it takes you. If you take one thing away from this video, let it be this. Inspiration never asks you to be a photocopier. It asks you to be curious and brave and messy. Take the spark, blow on it, risk a failure, catalog the happy accidents, and turn it into something that could only ever be yours. So keep experimenting, keep exploring, and keep finding new ways to tell old stories, because that's where your voice lives. Thank you so much for watching, and again, a massive thank you to everyone supporting me on Patreon. You make it possible for me to keep creating and experimenting and sharing this journey with all of you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the notification bell. It helps more than you think. See you next time, and until then, stay inspired, stay curious, and keep creating.